welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our guest author is Dr. Peter Kloponis. He's the author of Integrity Restored, Helping Catholic Families Win the Battle Against Pornography, published by Emmaus Road. And welcome to EWTN's Bookmark. You've been on a lot of programs here on EWTN, certainly Women of Grace, and with Jeanette dealing with this issue, Jim and Joy as well. So we thought it would be good to talk specifically about the book. Now, this is your second book on this topic, right? What was the first one?
The first book was called The Pornography Epidemic, A Catholic Approach. I called that the pamphlet that got out of hand. Janet Bankovic had asked me to write a pamphlet on pornography, and it ended up being 100 pages. So she said, well, let's just publish it as a short book, and we did, and it did very well. That was in 2012.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately,
in some ways, right?
Yes, and that was back in 2012. So.
And the thing with that book versus this book is you talk about this restoring. One is, I guess the first book from what I was reading in this was kind of like laying out what the issues are. This kind of recapitulates that a little deeper, but then talks about how you deal with that.
Exactly. The first book was a wonderful book, but after it came out, I realized there was so much more that needed to be said on it. And that's why I embarked on writing this book, the Integrity Restored book. So it's two books in one. The first half of the book talks about the pornography problem in our culture. What's going on? How is it affecting us? The second half of the book talks about what we can do about it, how we can protect ourselves, our family, our children, what those who may be struggling with addiction can do about it, how couples can heal from it. So the second is more the practical application.
Okay. Well, right in the beginning of the book, you've got pages and pages of testimonials from all different well-known Catholic personalities, etc., which obviously indicates to some degree the breadth of the problem. But one of the ones that struck me right away was Danny Abramowitz.
Yes.
And you got, obviously people know from the coach from Crossing the Goal for Us. I strongly recommend that you read Dr. Kloponis' book if you or someone close to you is struggling with pornography addiction. The thing that struck me with that was because, you know, that's a men's ministry that Danny really deals with. And he has told me that he's just been blown away himself by, it's kind of like anything. You know there's a problem, you know it's kind of out there, but the reality is it's much deeper and broader and more malevolent than you realize, right?
Exactly, and unfortunately few people want to talk about it, which only makes it worse.
It says, pornography addiction is an epidemic in America, and millions of men, women, and youth are becoming addicted. Now, we say addiction. Now, sometimes people say, well, don't we use that word too much? What do we mean when we say it's addicted? Because, you know, if I take a drug like heroin, there's a physical addiction. Are we saying that this has some sort of chemical change in people that's actually an addiction as well?
Yes, it affects the brain just like a drug does. So, you know, what happens when a man views an erotic image, it triggers the release of many different neurochemicals in the brain, which create a sense of excitement, create a high experience with that. The same thing is done by cocaine. It's not the cocaine that a person gets high off of, it's the neurochemical reaction that the cocaine triggers. So whether it's from an outside
that's an interesting
chemical,
way of looking at it.
Whether it's from an outside chemical such as drugs and alcohol, or through a behavior such as pornography or gambling, say, it affects the brain in the same way.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, because years ago people would just say that was a moral problem, and that's where you sometimes get with the Catholic issue of, well, how is this a moral problem? Is this an addiction? Is it a little bit of both? And certainly, as you talk about in the book, we've heard before, you know, this is what priests are hearing in the confessional more than ever before. Now, you cite some sources, right, as being Family Safe and Media Covenant Report. Covenant Eyes report said pornography plays a significant role in 56% of all divorces. Now, why do you see that? I kind of have my own ideas of why that is the case, but why do you think that's it has such an impact? Is that because it reduces the intimacy between the couple? What happens?
Well, first and foremost, there's the sense of betrayal that a spouse feels.
Which you talk about right at the beginning of the book.
Exactly.
Couple,
you know,
right?
when a wife discovers her husband viewing pornography, she's deeply hurt. She's deeply betrayed. For her, these aren't just images on a computer screen. This is an extramarital affair. This is cheating. And this is, what is so devastating to the marriage. And, as with any addiction, after a while, a tolerance develops. So little isn't enough. You need more of the drug to get the same effect.
The titillation. Right,
Exactly. So what happens is a lot of times it doesn't just stop with pornography. It can end up in things like extramarital affairs, anonymous sexual encounters, all kinds of other forms of infidelity. So the effects are just rampant in here, and it's devastating to a marriage.
Well, it's interesting in a way because in a sense you've got, and certainly you talk about all the forms, you go through the history from the 1940s on in the book, but the idea of the internet obviously is, let alone your phone.
Exactly.
You can take your porn with you, portable porn here, but the idea of, it's kind of unreal. You're dealing with it, and like you said, next thing you know, you're chatting with a real person. Next thing you know, you're on Ashley Madison. Next thing you know, you're having an affair, like you said, and each one brings it to another level of excitement, right?
Exactly. Slowly, that door is open to all kinds of vice and problems with that, and you don't realize, no one ever sets out to become addicted to anything. They don't. Usually they're using this substance to deal with some type of deep emotional wound, some type of pain. They're using it to control their pain, but then what happens is quickly that substance that they're using to control ends up controlling them.
Right.
And they end up locked and imprisoned in this terrible addiction that they can't get out of.
You say, well, pornography's addiction, this was from the study, is mainly a men's issue. It's growing among women.
Exactly.
Why?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, we have to understand that men and women are wired differently. Right? Men are visually stimulated, so they're looking at all the visual
no,
pornography.
that's all social dynamics, isn't it? Everybody's the same.
Well, we have neuroscience evidence now to prove this. Women are
babies being aborted are also people too, but nobody seems to care anymore.
Exactly. Women are relationally oriented. So for women, it's not so much the visual porn, but the written porn. Now, we've heard of the book, The 50 Shades of Grey. All right, really, it's pornography disguised as a relationship. So what we're finding is a lot of women are getting into social media as a form of pornography, chat rooms, Facebook, and so forth. This is what they're becoming addicted to. And just like for men, the visual pornography can lead to acting out with other people. For women, the written forms can end up leading them to act out with people. In fact, this is even more dangerous because studies have shown that women are far more likely to want to go and meet the people that they've encountered online for a sexual encounter than men are.
Because of that searching for real intimacy.
Exactly. It's the search for the relationship, which can really put them in a very physically dangerous situation.
Right.
Now, what is also scary to me is that we are finding a small but growing population of women who are becoming addicted to the visual porn that men are viewing. So it's almost as if, this pornography in our culture is rewiring women's brains to think and view things more like men, which is pretty scary.
Well, there's been a lot of push in many ways where the feminization of the male and in a sense the masculinization of the feminine has been pushed in our society. So I guess, you also say here that you encourage the model of healthy sexuality based on John Paul II's theology of the body and love and responsibility. How would you define that for our audience? We hear those terms all the time.
Okay, well, if we're going to talk about healthy sexuality, we have to ask the question, what is the purpose of sex? What is God's plan for sexuality? How did He create us as sexual beings? We need to know that. That's the foundation, that's the base that we start from. From there we come to a greater understanding of sexuality and what it does, what its purpose is. And this is what writings like Theology of the Body talk about. That's focusing a lot on sexuality. Love and Responsibility, which focuses a lot on relationship. When we understand that, that's where we develop a greater sense of what sexuality is all about, what intimacy is all about, what healthy relationship is all about. And that's what people are really looking for. What we found is that for people who become addicted to pornography, it's really not about sex. It's all about intimacy. They're searching for connection. And so this is what they have to focus on, and this is what writings like Theology of the Body and Love and Responsibility offer.
Right, and I always think love and responsibility, the problem is we've tried to separate those two in society almost all across the board. Now you say throughout the book I present stories of real people, both men and women, have struggled with and suffered from pornography. Others are amalgamations of people. Why did you decide to do it both ways?
Well, in order to get a couple points across, in some cases where it is the real story of a couple. I wanted to get across the emotion, how this affects them as people and what they're going through. In the amalgamations, I wanted to get across sort of the dynamics of the addiction, how it affects lives, how it progresses. So I use them both together to really get the messages across.
Now, in the beginning, you talk about a couple, Tom and Janet, and you say here where they came in and she was upset and found out it was pornography. You said Tom knew his pornography use was a problem. He tried to stop many times, but he kept going back. And that's because of the addiction part?
The addiction
as
part,
much as he
right.
wanted to say no, he couldn't say no?
Yes. You know, again, we have to look at, when we see any addiction, we have to look at it as two sides of a coin. There's a physical side and there's the emotional side. With the emotional side, we're looking at using it as a drug to ease some type of emotional pain. You may have heard the term self-medicating. That's it. On the physical side, we look at how it affects the brain. You know, it triggers this massive release of neurochemicals, which the brain can become dependent on. You know, this is what it becomes addicted to. And what happens is that, you know, a man, you know, he may be tempted to view pornography. He acts out with it. Obviously, he feels terrible later and makes the vow, I will never do it again. But then a day or two later, he's back at it. Why is it? Well, those chemical levels in the brain are starting to go back down. And the brain says, uh-oh, we don't want this. You know, we want to get back up to where it was, and we know exactly where to go for it, the pornography. And this is what draws him back over and over again. So it's the combination, you know, initially he's using it to ease emotional pain, but also there comes that addiction, which makes it really hard to stay away from it.
Now, I was noticing in his particular story, he was involved basically when he was pretty young, even prepubescent, and I'm sure, you know, we're seeing more and more of that as we know. I think I heard something about 6th graders or whatever. And Tom admitted on a deeper level he wanted to get caught. Now, is that his Catholic guilt? Or does that sound good when you finally get caught? You say, well, I wanted to get caught. What is it?
Well, I think deep down there is a deep need to get caught because they realize they are trapped in this and there's no way out. And they want to get help. They want to ask for help. Unfortunately, the shame that they feel because of it keeps them from really seeking help. So, you know, when they are caught, in the end they see, wow, this really is a blessing. Thank God for this. Thank God, because they wanted help. They really wanted this to come out so they could get the help they needed. And there may be a little bit of Catholic guilt in that, but who says that there's anything really wrong with that?
Oh, I'm not saying there's anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with feeling guilty about things you shouldn't be doing. I mean,
you know, and we have to, in dealing with this issue, we have to separate guilt from shame. You
what's
know?
the difference?
Well, shame focuses on the person, guilt focuses on the action.
Okay.
So guilt is the emotion that says, okay, you did something wrong and you got to fix it. You have to do something about it. Shame says you did something wrong, and because of this, you're this terrible, horrible person, and you should just go and hide. Just hide it.
And you'll never be able to really change anyway.
No.
And after you've done this, what till these people find out about you?
Exactly.
The devil whispers in your ear.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Okay.
But what that leads to is a terrible loneliness and isolation that is really crippling. But unfortunately, that kind of keeps them stuck there. So, you know, getting caught, I see that as a blessing. That's an act of the Holy Spirit stepping in and pulling a person out of that shame.
Right. Well, one of the places here, there's, before we get to this part, because I was listening to what you're saying, the emotional side, I thought this was interesting. On page 41, talks about all these kind of the typical wounds that men are coping with. Like you said, I'm self-medicating, so some of the different ones. Narcissism, this is becoming a big problem today, especially in young people. Extreme form of selfishness. So why would that want me to be interested in pornography? Is that a function of control? Is that a function of the fact that I don't need to give anything of myself to get this high?
Yeah. It's all of that. Unfortunately, when you look at young people in our culture, for a couple of generations now, they've been raised with this incredible sense of entitlement.
That's not good, huh?
It's not good. You know, you have parents, they put their kids up on pedestals, they give them everything they want. You know, in our culture, they're on sports teams where everybody wins a trophy, and there comes a sense that, you know, my needs are paramount. And I have the right to get them met any way I want. If that means using pornography, I'm going to use it, and no one can say that I'm wrong.
I shouldn't be frustrated in anything I'm trying to do. It may hurt my self-image, right?
Exactly. And as long as it's being done between consenting adults, there's no problem.
Right. Okay. And in this case, there's only one consenting adult.
Mm-hmm.
Family of course, if they're addicted, maybe they're not really consenting.
Yeah.
Family of origin wounds. So obviously, people growing up with skewed views of sexuality, right?
Exactly. I work with so many people growing up in homes where there's abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, neglect, a death in the family. The other day I was working with a young man in his 20s. He lost his mother to breast cancer when he was 13. He never was really able to properly grieve it, and he just self-medicated with pornography. Divorce is a huge wound. Unfortunately in our culture, because it's so prevalent, we tend to downplay the effects of divorce on children, but it's traumatic.
Well, because the theory used to be it would be better for the children.
We find that it's not,
Right.
And of course, if there's an addiction in the family, often when I work with people who are addicted, you go through their family history and you see there are addictions that run through the generations. The substances may be different.
Which might be the reason that people got divorced in the first place for
Exactly.
that child. This was what, peer rejection, and the other one you mentioned earlier, loneliness.
Peer rejection is a big thing. A lot of times I work with men who grew up and, they were rejected by their peers. Maybe they were bullied. Maybe, they were the fat kid. They were the short kid. They weren't good at sports and so forth. And they were rejected by their peers. And that's very painful for a child. Very painful. Peer acceptance is so important. And then, of course, most people who get into pornography, it's usually in their adolescent years or teenage years, often out of curiosity. But these types of kids tend to turn to it to self-medicate for that pain of rejection.
And there's some other ones here, excessive pressures, etc. This is one here that struck me, anger. Why anger?
Well, anger we know is very much associated with addictions for acting out. When a person is angry, what are they doing? They're holding on to lots of resentments.
Okay.
A lot of resentments going back through their entire life. All right, and there's this sense of entitlement that comes out of this. I've had such a hard life, tough life. It isn't easy. Nobody seems to be on my side. Nothing's going my way, so I deserve some relief. I deserve a break. I'm entitled to it, and that's what can lead into that.
Now, later on in the book here, you have on page 127, basically how pornography affects children and teens. I thought some of this was interesting, and you're talking about all the different ways we're inundated with it. But I thought this was important. These messages are different for boys and girls, what they get. And the messages for boys, women are there for your pleasure. It's okay to use them. Women don't have thoughts or feelings. They don't need to be respected. This is the one I remember starting to hear when I was in college, which I knew. Women love sex and can't get enough of it.
Exactly.
I remember this one guy saying, "Oh, I wanted this much weed." I don't think that's the case. But that seems to be more and more. So no wonder you have guys going out with girls who are expecting to basically go to bed with her the first, and if it's not, I think in reading in this, the third date, then there's something wrong with the relationship or something.
Exactly.
Right?
They're judging their relationships based on what they see in pornography.
And then you go into you talk about, there's some others there. Then you talk about, for the girls, it's interesting. In order to be loved and desired by men, you must look and act like a porn star. Now, sometimes you see these little kids being dressed up, and I'm not talking about Honey Boo Boo type things, but I mean in the stores or in mainline, and the kids are all dressed like and you're saying, how old are those kids? And they're dressing for their for their classmates, all about what I look like.
And it's unfortunate, but sex sells, and we know for a fact that many of the big designers today are now targeting the tweeners. They're getting them younger and younger, and they're really over-sexualizing them. They're bringing them into a world that they're not ready for yet. Cognitively, their brains are not developed enough to where they can understand it, but they're being pushed into this sexualized culture.
Right. That's why I always used to think that the grammar school that goes through 8th grade is a better model than kind of having this middle school, which tends to push 6th and 7th and 8th graders into this, we're really sort of in high school, and kind of a thing was never necessarily a good idea. Now, you also talk about the fact that in this book you can actually evaluate your risk for internet pornography addiction on page 54, so that you actually could take this test. Did you ever take the test?
Yes.
How'd you do?
I did pretty well.
Yeah.
I tested as a low risk.
Okay.
I did.
Well,
I can't remember my number, but I remember.
I was just
it's
wondering
low
with
risk.
these kind of things, because one of the things I know we always tried to do in our house was to say, especially when the kids and everything were young, there was one computer, it was in the main room that everybody could see. Because as much as we all like to believe that we won't be tempted, the person who thinks they can't be tempted is the most likely to be tempted.
Exactly.
And so you end up with this thing. And you had talked about also the whole idea of how much money is involved in this. And I mentioned earlier about kind of how we got here.
Yep.
It's interesting though, I remember the Playboy magazine, obviously, in the 60s, sexual revolution, and the 70s, it was a free love kind of thing into late 60s, into the 70s. And then you get into the 80s with the VCRs, of course, and we all remember going into the videotape store if you're old enough, and the little closet back room there, that people would get whatever they wanted, and obviously the DVDs and then the internet, and it gets more and more invasive. But the one that struck me the most interesting was you started off with the pinup girls from the 1940s, which we all know from the World War II movies, Betty Grable or Rita Hayworth or whoever it might have been at the time. And you actually say that in a sense was the beginning of it.
Yeah. Well, and what I see there is, you have these pinup girls dressed in these bathing suits and bikinis, usually on calendars. Now, of course, those bathing suits and bikinis were very modest compared to today's standards. However, it was the first time that we as a culture became accustomed to seeing women who were not fully clothed, and we accepted it. And as I go through the decades, you can see how slowly the doors open, that Pandora's box is open, and every decade, every stage, we accepted it. So now, we have the 2000 teens where pornography is interactive now.
Right.
It's not something you view, it's something you participate in. So you can see how we came to this way, and I put that in there because you realize, we're a Christian culture. Just 100 years ago, if a woman showed as much as a bare ankle or an elbow, it was considered scandalous.
Right, exactly.
So how did we get here? What happened? And this is what I did in my research. I saw, it was slowly the door opening in every decade.
And also looking back at some of the, Masters and Johnson and all these other studies, which all turned out to be basically incorrect.
Junk science, the Kinsey studies,
but it gave people the excuse that, see, it's okay. In fact, they say it's healthier. Exactly. And that's what, even in the 60s, a lot of people thought those things made sense. Well, if people who are attracted to this can have a place to do it, then they'll leave others alone. But that's not the case, as you indicate.
It's not the case. In fact, you look at a lot of the sexual predators out there, the majority of them did start with pornography. So
which if people step back, of course, it makes plenty of sense why that would be that would be the case. One thing I'm wondering too with that, even in marriages and relationship, and you'd say, well, as a Catholic family, how could this be happening? But of course, it's there too. It's everywhere. But the idea of the relationship, and I wonder, since you've got so much pressure in a lot of ways for all of us, from a certain narcissistic to self-actualize, be the best we can be, everything's, I shouldn't be unhappy. If I'm not happy, something's wrong. Rather than the old, I remember Storge, which Father Groeschel used to talk about, that the love that people build on, you know what I mean, to keep together through the ups and downs of life. And in a lot of ways, I see with some of this stuff is, hey, listen, I don't have to deal with you. I don't have to worry about whether my wife's happy or unhappy about whether she has a headache this week or not. I'm taken care of, and that just separates
exactly
the relationship. Right?
You talk about Pope John Paul II's writings, love and responsibility. What we've really accepted in our culture today is love without responsibility, and that's what we want. We want love on our terms for what we're going to get. There's no responsibility, nothing. And it's a shame because again, it leaves people in marriages very lonely, very selfish, and yet very lonely.
Right, and like you say about was it Jane in the beginning, Tom and his wife, that whole idea of being betrayed.
Yes.
That in many ways it's no different than feeling like you're having an affair with somebody else. Now, in the second part of the book, where you talk about all the things that you can do to protect your family and how to deal with these things, you talk about obstacles to recovery on page 240.
Yes.
And the number one here is denial. Men struggle. That seems to be, you would think, of course, I'm going to deny it. But this one, pride.
Yeah. There's a lot of pride, and I find that in a lot of men that they may realize that they have a problem, but they think, well, I'm strong enough, I can handle this on my own. often I find this in people in positions of authority, positions, public positions and so forth.
Afraid it might get out or something.
Yeah, if it may get out or whatever. But there's that whole sense that I'm strong enough, I can pull myself up by my own bootstraps, and this is what I'm going to do. Unfortunately, it rarely works.
Right, you also talk about shame and fear, and this is another one where you would say lack of commitment. How do you know if somebody's got, when you're dealing with somebody, what would be an indication in your mind that though they're there, there's this kind of lack of commitment to really change?
Well, they're really not doing the work. When I meet with a client, we'll have weekly counseling or bi-weekly counseling sessions, and obviously there's homework to do. I tell people the real work of recovery doesn't happen in our counseling session. It's the other days of the week that you're working on it. And if they're not doing their homework, they're not doing the work, they're not going to their 12-step meetings, they're not working on communication with their spouse, they're not working on their prayer life, all these things that are necessary for healthy recovery, if they're not doing it, they're not committed to it. And there have been times when I've actually had to tell them, and I have to say, it just doesn't seem like you're really ready for this yet. Why don't we take a break? And then when you really want this, then come back and we'll work on it.
Right. How long did it take you to put the book together?
It took about a year to put it together. A lot of late nights. I'm married with young children, so I tell people this book was written between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. at night when the house was quiet. But it really was a labor of love. It was a lot of research. I had walls full of Post-it notes and so forth. But I realized there was such a need to get this message out. And even though there were several really good books out there on this written by Catholics, they're written by lay people, more or less their own experiences. There needed to be
that's true. I've interviewed some of them, right? Yeah.
There needed to be a book written by a Catholic mental health professional who could really tell you, what's going on with the addiction, with the brain, with relationships, all of that going on. So, and that's where this came out of. And we need this in our church. Unfortunately, the Protestants are light years ahead of us when it comes to dealing with this issue. They've been dealing with this about maybe 10 years longer than we have.
And why is that, just before we go?
Well, I think a lot of it goes back to the way they worship. Our worship is more focused on sacrament. Theirs is focused more on scripture and sermon. So a lot of the sermons are about scripture, applying it to daily life, marriage and family life and so forth. We know great people like Dr. James Dobson and focus on the family and so forth. Right. So you are going to find more books out there on those topics, but we need it too. And so this is why I came out with that book. I'm actually coming out with another book now. The next book is going to be called Integrity Starts Here, which is sort of a workbook, and it really is the recovery program for those who are addicted. Right, this is the path to recovery.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Peter Kliphonis, for joining us here on Bookmark and for doing this fine work. Integrity Restored is the title, Helping Catholic Families Win the Battle Against Pornography. It's published by Emmaus Road, and it's available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Unfortunately, it's a very important book, and you should check it out. Join us next time right here on Bookmark.